Anderson was Joe Montana before Joe Montana.
So who is Ken Anderson? To be honest, I didn't know till I started digging deep into the criminally underrated NFL players. Ken Anderson's name kept coming up, so I grinded the All-22 and discovered the discrimination towards this elite quarterback.
He's the most underrated player, not in the Hall of Fame.
Let's take a look at who I think is the NFL's most underrated player of all time. First, let's set some ground rules. How are we classifying underrated? Firstly, they can't be in the NFL Hall of Fame. I feel like that goes without saying. Secondly, they can't have won a Super Bowl, at least at a key position, say quarterback, running back, wide receiver. Winning a Super Bowl gives you enough recognition to get past being underrated. And they can't be on a dynasty. Being on a dynasty obviously props up everybody's level of play, so I want to be as fair as possible. Ken Anderson checks all this criteria. He did go to a Super Bowl, but he didn't win. So let's take a look at his career. He was selected by the Cincinnati Bengals in the third round of the 1971 draft out of Augustana College in Illinois. That school's only produced 2 NFL players in its history. He was scouted by Bengals offensive coordinator Bill Walsh. We'll go back to him shortly. Anderson's breakout season came in 1973 as he led the Bengals to a 10-4 record and threw for 2,428 yards while having 18 touchdowns to 12 interceptions and had a 54.4% completion percentage, while also leading them to an AFC Central Division title. As we further analyze the numbers of Anderson, I want to keep in mind the era he was playing in, especially touchdowns and interceptions. During the 70s and 80s, it was very common for quarterbacks to have more interceptions than touchdowns, or close to it, and there are quarterbacks from that era who are in the Hall of Fame who have more interceptions than touchdowns overall. In 1974, the Bengals struggled through injuries, but Anderson still threw for a league-high completion percentage at 64.9%, yards 2,667, and pass rating 95.7, while going for 18 touchdowns to 10 interceptions. In 1975, Anderson had his best year yet, and so did the Bengals. Anderson threw for a league-high 3,169 yards, while throwing 21 touchdowns to 11 interceptions, with a 60.5 completion percentage. He was also named to his first Pro Bowl and led the Bengals to a 10-3 record. Anderson did have a long career at 16 years in the league, but I don't want to bore you with statistics from every year showing how good he was. Instead, let's see how he fares against other Hall of Fame quarterbacks. Here's just a few examples. He led the league in pass rating 4 times. Only Hall of Famer Steve Young did it more often, at 6 times. He led the NFL in yards per attempt twice. He led the NFL in passing yards twice, which is more often than Hall of Famers such as Joe Montana, Steve Young, Terry Bradshaw, and John Elway. He also led the NFL more often in passing yards per attempt than Hall of Famers included but not limited to Aikman, Dan Marino, and Joe Montana. PFL's Hall of Fame monitor, which gauges a player's worthiness for Canton, has Anderson slightly above QB Kenny Stabler, who is already inducted, and he's also far ahead of Hall of Famers like Bob Greasy and Warren Moon. And just to emphasize how good Anderson was, and how important he was to the Bengals franchise, this was the Bengals' record pre, during, and post Anderson. The Bengals won 37.5% of their games before he came, they won 52.9% during his career, and they've won just 38.8% since he retired. So let's get back to Bill Walsh. He was the offensive coordinator for the Bengals and masterminded the infamous West Coast offense during his time there. Anderson definitely benefited from this. Walsh's system lent itself to higher passer ratings. Contrary to the trend at the time, the offense emphasized ball control passing. In 1974, Anderson led the NFL in completion percentage by completing high percentage screens, flares, and checkdowns to his backs out of the backfield. He completed almost as many passes to his backs, 110, as he did to his wide receivers and tight ends, at 112. That's not to say this scheme is only checkdowns, but shorter passes were a big part of it, and that benefited the quarterback in terms of higher passer rating, higher completion percentage, and so on. Despite all this, Walsh left in 1975, and while the Bengals slumped for a few years, Anderson had an amazing career post-Walsh and even met him in the Super Bowl in 1991. Anderson was the most effective passer, highest yards per attempt in the NFL twice. Consider that all-time greats Marino and Montana combined to lead the NFL in yards per attempt just twice between the two of them. And what I'll say about the West Coast offenses, we never discredit Montana or Young's career because of this scheme, and we shouldn't. The same applies to Anderson. He also literally went to the Super Bowl 6 years after Walsh left. He won the MVP in 1981, Offensive Player of the Year, and took them to the Super Bowl while leading the lead in touchdown rate at 6.1%, interception rate 2.1%, and passer rating 98.4. That Super Bowl run was also the first time the Bengals had ever won a playoff game, and although they fell to the Niners, he had a good game, going for 25 of 34 passes for 300 yards, 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions, while having 14 rushing yards and a touchdown on 5 rushing attempts. His 25 completions and 73.5% completion percentage were both Super Bowl records at the time. He should be in the Hall of Fame despite never really being talked about. Firstly, a large part of his career was overshadowed by the Steelers dynasty. He led the Bengals to double-digit victories in 3 of his first 4 seasons, years. Then called the AFC Central, the Bengals finished second behind the Steelers 3 of those 4 years, despite an average record of roughly 10-4. Secondly, the West Coast offense. Critics have said Anderson was a system quarterback or a dink and dunk artist, but that's simply not the case. In 1973 to 76, he was throwing deep bombs to Isaac Curtis, who had a 4.3 30-yard dash, and Curtis averaged 19.9 yards a reception in those 4 seasons. He also ranked second in receiving yards and receiving touchdowns, and that showed that Anderson had a strong arm and often went deep. Also, like I said, he had a good career after Walsh left. Thirdly, he didn't have any Super Bowl wins or AFL titles. However, there are plenty of Hall of Fame quarterbacks who don't have rings, for example Warren Moon, Dan Marino, and Jim Kelly. As I mentioned, after Walsh left, he did have a few down years, but again this has happened to other Hall of Famers. For example, Kurt Warner hit the ground running and was elite for 3 years with the St. Louis Rams, the greatest show on turf, but he got injured and was eventually released, and it took Warner some time to ascend again, but he eventually led the Cardinals to an NFC Championship game in 2008. In conclusion, I don't see why Anderson's not in the Hall of Fame. Many lesser quarterbacks have already been inducted. You could say he isn't underrated because a lot of people say he's the most underrated, but I think it just means that people are looking, actually see the truth. Alright, thanks for watching.